A flame flickers in the darkness. The wind carries the smell of resin, of wet earth, of smoke. Somewhere in a cave that still has no name, 30,000 years ago, someone is awake looking at the fire. Tonight we're going to return to that moment. We're going to discover how our species survived the Stone Age, without metal, without writing, without anything that the earth and the animals living in it didn't give. Imagine that you strip yourself of everything. Not metaphorically. Literally. Without clothes made in a factory. Without rubber-soled shoes. Without a steel knife in your pocket. Without a phone. Without any memory of anything you've learned in school about how to survive. Just your body, the landscape around you, and what you're capable of learning before cold or hunger or some predator decides you've had enough time. Now imagine that this scenario isn't an experiment or a game. It's simply reality. The only reality that exists. And in that reality, your children depend on you doing it right. And your children's children. And your children's children's children, in a chain that extends for tens of thousands of years and that arrives in a way we still struggle to fully understand, until here. Until this moment. Until you. The Stone Age isn't an epoch of history. It's the epoch of history. The longest, the most formative, the one that made us everything we are. It spans from more than 3 million years ago, when our ancestors started carving the first stone tools in the plains of eastern Africa, until about 5,000 or 6,000 years ago, when metal began to replace rock in people's hands. Everything that happened after, empires, wars, religions, cities, sciences, is a blink compared to those millions of years of stone and fire and silence. How did they survive? That's the question of tonight. Not abstractly but concretely. What they ate and how they got it. Where they slept and how they kept warm. How they related to each other, how they transmitted knowledge, how they treated their sick and their dead. How they found in stone and bone and wood the tools with which to compensate for the weakness of a body that had no claws or fangs or enough hair for the cold. And how, amid all that, they also found time and energy and need to create art, to make music, to bury their own with flowers. Because that also happened. The Stone Age wasn't just brutal survival. It was also the moment when something profoundly human took shape, something that can't be measured or dated but that lived in those caves and on those plains and that still lives in us today. The landscape they lived in was different from the one we know. Not radically different in all places, because Earth 30,000 years ago wasn't an alien planet. It had mountains and valleys and rivers and coasts. But it also had glaciers where there are now cities. It had smaller seas and coasts that today are underwater. It had animals that no longer exist and didn't have animals we today consider common. Oak and pine and birch existed, but their boundaries were different. Rivers flowed in different courses. The valleys that today seem to us gentle and domesticated were then places where each decision could have irreversible consequences. And in that landscape, our species learned to exist. Not suddenly, not with an instruction manual, but slowly, over generations, through trial and error and careful transmission of each small discovery to those who came after. It was the longest and most patient learning in human history. And it's what made everything else possible. Fire is the beginning of everything. Not in a poetic sense, but literally. Without mastery of fire, human history would have been a different history, probably shorter and certainly darker in every sense of that word. Our most remote ancestors, those who lived in Africa 2 or 3 million years ago, didn't have fire. They had stone, and knew how to use it to cut and scrape, but they didn't have fire of their own. Fire existed in the world, of course. Lightning set it in forests and savannas. Volcanoes produced it in more dramatic ways. And for a long time, the hominids living in those savannas related to it in the only way possible, fleeing when it got too close, and perhaps approaching afterwards to eat animals that had been roasted in fires. The leap from fearing fire to controlling it is one of the great mysteries of prehistory, because it left no clear evidence of exactly how it happened. The oldest signs of controlled fire use are between 1 and 2 million years old, but they're ambiguous. The most solid and widely accepted evidence is from about 400,000 years ago, at sites like Kizum in Israel or Terra Amata in France, where hearths have been found with charcoal and burned bones arranged in ways that only make sense if someone deliberately placed them there. By then, fire was no longer an accident or a rarity. It was a technology. And like all technology, it could be learned, taught, and improved. The techniques for producing it that Stone Age humans developed weren't simple. The oldest and most widespread was percussion, striking pyrite or marcasite against flint to produce sparks that were directed toward a bed of prepared tinder with specific materials. Dried and crumbled birch bark, tinder fungi that absorb sparks as if expecting them, fluff from plants like thistle or sweet flag. Once the spark caught the tinder and the tinder started smoking, you had to blow carefully, with a patience that's learned and not improvised, until you got the flame. The other main technique was friction, rubbing two pieces of wood with the correct speed and pressure until the heat from friction produced glowing dust that fell onto the tinder. The bow drill, a bow whose string wrapped around a vertical stick that spun on a horizontal board, multiplied the speed and made the process more efficient. It required specific materials, woods with characteristics of precise hardness and dryness, and a coordination of movements that's learned with practice and perfected over time. What this means, what it really implies, is that lighting fire in the Stone Age was an act of knowledge. It wasn't a matter of luck or strength. It required understanding materials, mastering the technique, having practiced enough to do it even when hands were cold or time was pressing. And that knowledge was transmitted. From fathers to sons, from masters to apprentices, from group to group. It was part of the most valuable cultural capital a community could have. Once the fire was lit, it had to be kept alive. This wasn't simple either. The fire had to be fed, but not too much fuel too quickly, which would suffocate it. It had to be protected from wind and rain. In the winter, it had to be kept burning sometimes for weeks without going out, because letting it die meant having to spend hours trying to relight it when the cold might be so extreme that it would freeze your fingers before you managed to get a spark. To keep the fire alive during the day, people arranged themselves in shifts around it. Someone was always awake, always feeding it, always maintaining the delicate balance between having enough fuel and not having so much that the fire became unmanageable. At night, in winter, the fire was the center of everything. The whole group arranged itself around it, with the very young and the very old closest to the warmth, and the healthiest adults on the outside, ready to wake if something threatened the group or if the fire needed attention. The fire shaped the space where the group lived. Whether in a cave or in an open-air camp, the hearth became the center. Everything else was organized in relation to it. The sleeping areas were where the warmth was enough to make sleep possible without freezing to death. The place where tools were made was near the light. The place where meat was processed was far enough away that the smell and the blood wouldn't bring scavengers too close to where people slept. The fire organized space the way a city is organized around its center, and like a city, that organization spoke to the intelligence and the foresight of the people who created it. Cooking transformed food in ways that made it more digestible, more nutritious, safer. Meat, cooked on a stick or in a stone bowl of hot water, was easier to chew and to digest than raw meat. Plants that were too hard or too bitter to eat raw became edible when heated. Bones, heated in water along with other bones and scraps, produced a broth rich in nutrients that could be drunk or could be poured back over food to add flavor and nutrition. The cooking techniques that developed in the Stone Age, roasting, boiling, steaming, smoking, drying, are still the fundamental cooking techniques we use today, and they were invented by people who had no books and no scientific understanding of nutrition, but who understood through observation and experience that cooking made food better. The knowledge of fire, the mastery of its production and maintenance and use, was one of the greatest achievements of human evolution. More important than any tool, more important than any weapon, more important than any artistic achievement. Because without fire, none of the rest was possible. Art would have been impossible in the darkness of caves. Hunting large animals would have been more difficult and more dangerous. surviving the ice would have been impossible. The whole complex of human civilization, if you can call it that, built on knowledge and cooperation and culture, rested on the foundation of controlled fire. And the fact that this knowledge could be transmitted, that it could be taught and learned, that it could be shared across generations and across groups, changed everything. It meant that the knowledge of firemaking didn't have to be reinvented by each generation. Once learned, it could be refined and improved. And it meant that the groups that had fire had an advantage so enormous that within a few 100,000 years, groups without it had either learned it or disappeared from the archaeological record. Food was the other pillar of survival in the Stone Age. And the story of how people got food tells us more about the intelligence and the organization and the cooperation of Ice Age hunter-gatherers than almost anything else. Hunting large animals was dangerous and unpredictable. A hunt could be successful and feed the group for days, or it could fail and result in serious injury or death. So hunting large animals was necessary but couldn't be the only food source. The groups that survived were the ones that understood this and that diversified their diet. The smaller animals, rabbits, birds, small deer, could be caught with traps and snares that didn't require the risk of confronting a large animal directly. An animal caught in a trap or a snare that has been set days before in a location where the animal regularly passed was free protein that required far less risk and far less energy than a dangerous hunt. The knowledge of where animals passed, when they passed, what time of day they preferred, what kinds of traps worked best for different animals, was accumulated knowledge that could be taught and refined. The gathering of plants was equally important and often provided more calories than hunting. Nuts, seeds, berries, roots, tubers, leaves, bark. Depending on the season and the location, plants provided a significant portion of the diet. And unlike hunting, which was male-dominated and required strength and speed and aggression, gathering could be done by everyone. Children learning to identify plants, elderly people who could no longer hunt, women who were gathering and watching children at the same time. Fishing, in the places where water was available and accessible, was another source of protein. Fish traps made of stone or wood, nets made from plant fibers, hooks made from bone or wood. All of these required knowledge and skill and planning. In some locations, near rivers or coasts where fish were abundant, fishing was the primary source of protein, and entire cultures developed around the exploitation of marine and freshwater resources. The organization of hunting required language and planning and cooperation. A hunt of a large animal like a mammoth or a bison couldn't be done by individuals. It required the coordinated action of multiple people, people who understood the plan that had been discussed before the hunt began, people who could take on different roles, some driving the animal toward a cliff, others waiting to strike with spears, others following to finish the kill. And this coordination had to work the first time, because there wasn't a second chance. The animal was gone, and the hunters went hungry. This need for coordination drove the development of language. You can't coordinate a complex hunt with gestures alone. You need to be able to discuss strategy before the hunt, to assign roles, to discuss what to do if something goes wrong. Language made this possible. And language, once developed, enabled all the other forms of human knowledge and culture that came later. Tools were the extension of the human body that made it possible to survive and thrive without physical advantages that other animals had. The story of Stone Age tools is the story of gradual refinement, gradual increase in sophistication, gradual accumulation of knowledge about what worked and what didn't. The earliest tools, from more than 2 million years ago, were simple. A rock struck against another rock in a way that produced a sharp edge. The edge wasn't precise, and it dulled quickly, but it was sharp enough to cut through skin and flesh. It was enough to butcher an animal that was already dead, either hunted by the person using the tool or killed by another predator and scavenged. Over hundreds of thousands of years, tools became more refined. The early hand axes, from perhaps 1.7 million years ago, were carefully shaped pieces of stone that had two sharp edges on opposite sides of the stone. They could be used for cutting and for scraping. They require skill to make. You have to understand the properties of stone, how it breaks, what angle of strike produces a useful edge. But once mastered, the technique produced a useful tool that could be adapted to many different tasks. The development of blade technology, after about 50,000 years ago, marked another major advance. Instead of producing a few thick, heavy tools from each core of stone, blade technology produced dozens of thin, sharp blades from each core. The blades could be hafted, attached to wooden or bone shafts, to produce composite tools. A blade attached to a wooden spear shaft with sinew became a lethal hunting weapon. Blades arranged in a row in a bone or wood handle became a saw or a sickle for cutting plants. The invention of bone and antler tools added a whole new dimension to the toolkit. Bone and antler are different from stone. They have grain, they can be shaped with different techniques, they can be bent and shaped when heated. Harpoon points with barbed heads, fishing hooks, needles, musical instruments, works of art. All of these could be made from bone and antler. The bone harpoon with barbs designed to catch and hold in flesh is a remarkable technical achievement, showing an understanding of biomechanics that is not instinctive but learned. The development of adhesives was another crucial step. Early adhesives were probably natural substances like plant resins or animal glues, but by the Stone Age people had learned to produce adhesives that could hold composite tools together reliably. A blade attached to a wooden shaft with sinew and glued with plant resin could last for weeks of use, making the composite tool a cost-effective way to use the material. Instead of a whole piece of bone or stone being devoted to one tool, a small piece of sharp stone or bone attached to a wooden shaft could do the same job for much longer. The sophistication of Stone Age tools is often underestimated by people who haven't tried to make them. The knowledge required to understand stone, what types of stone work best for different purposes, how stone breaks, what angle of strike produces a useful edge, is not intuitive. It has to be learned through observation and practice. And once learned, it has to be taught to the next generation. The presence of the same tool types across large geographic areas and across long stretches of time suggests that the knowledge was actively transmitted and valued. The social organization of Stone Age hunter-gatherers was probably more complex than many people imagine. The groups weren't simple egalitarian collectives where everyone was equal and decisions were made by everyone together. Neither were they rigidly hierarchical societies like the civilizations that came later. They were, probably, organized in ways that depended on the specific environment and the specific needs of the group at any given time. A hunting band, the group that set out together to hunt large animals, might be all males or might include some females. It probably included the best hunters, the ones with the most experience and the most skill. Leadership of the hunt probably fell to whoever had the most knowledge of the animal being hunted and the territory where it was being hunted. That leadership probably wasn't permanent. A person who was an excellent mammoth hunter might not be the best leader in a different situation, in a different environment, hunting different animals. The larger group, the group that camped together and shared resources, might have included several hunting bands and also included the very young, the elderly, the pregnant women and nursing mothers. Decision-making in this larger group probably involved discussion, with the opinions of experienced hunters and experienced gatherers weighing more heavily than those of people with less experience. The oldest woman might be the repository of knowledge about plants and might make the final decision about where the camp should move when the plants that were being gathered started to run out. The oldest man might be the repository of knowledge about animals and weather patterns. Children were probably educated through a combination of play, observation, and direct instruction. A child would spend time with the hunters, learning how to track animals, how to use weapons, how to behave in dangerous situations. A child would spend time with the gatherers, learning which plants were edible, which were medicinal, which were poisonous, learning the seasons of ripening, learning the places where plants grew. The best education was probably learning by doing, under the supervision of experienced adults. The role of women in Stone Age society is often misrepresented. Women were probably responsible for gathering, which in many environments provided more calories than hunting. Women probably participated in hunting, at least in situations where hunting involved setting traps or driving animals, rather than direct confrontation with large animals. Women probably participated in making tools, in cooking, in all the activities necessary for survival. And women were the ones who gave birth and nursed children, which was crucial to the continuation of the group. The treatment of the sick and the injured provides evidence of care and compassion. Skeletons from the Stone Age show signs of injuries that healed, suggesting that injured people were cared for by the group during their recovery. Some people with disabilities that would have made it difficult for them to participate fully in hunting and gathering survived for years, suggesting that the group didn't simply abandon people who couldn't contribute directly to survival. This suggests that there was a concept of social responsibility, a sense that the group took care of its members, even if they couldn't directly reciprocate. The role of the elderly in Stone Age society was probably more important than we usually recognize. In a world without writing, without books, without any means of recording information except in the minds of living people, the elderly were living libraries. They were the repositories of knowledge about the land, about the animals, about the plants, about the weather patterns and the seasons. An elderly woman who had lived for 60 or 70 years had seen many cycles of seasons, many changes in the landscape, many changes in the availability of plants and animals. She had learned which years were good years for certain plants, which years were bad. She knew the stories of the group, the history of conflicts with other groups, the locations of the best hunting grounds and the best gathering areas. That knowledge was valuable, irreplaceable. Losing her meant losing decades of accumulated knowledge that couldn't be easily recovered. The presence of elderly people in the group probably increased their survivability. Archaeological evidence suggests that many Stone Age groups included people who were older and probably less able to contribute directly to hunting, but whose knowledge made them more valuable to keep alive than to abandon. A group with an elderly woman who knew where the emergency food sources were in times of scarcity had a better chance of surviving a bad year than a group without that knowledge. The elderly were probably treated with respect, deferred to in decisions about movement and settlement. They were probably given the best places around the fire, the places with the most warmth. They were probably first to receive good food from a successful hunt. And in exchange, they provided knowledge, advice, continuity with the past. The death of an elderly person was probably recognized as a significant loss. The burials of Stone Age people, some of them more elaborate than others, some of them with objects placed with the body, suggest that death was recognized as significant and worthy of ritual. The presence of flowers in some burials, as evidenced by pollen analysis, suggests that dying was recognized as worthy of respect and marks of honor. The grieving process, mourning, lamentation, all of these are probably ancient, rooted in the Stone Age. The capacity to feel loss, to recognize that someone is gone and will not return, to ritualize that loss through ceremony, is profoundly human. And it's probably ancient, going back to the earliest human groups. Art appeared in the Stone Age. Not refined, trained art, but art nonetheless. Small figurines carved from bone and ivory, paintings on cave walls, carvings on bone pieces. These objects have no obvious practical function. They couldn't be eaten, they couldn't be worn as tools, they couldn't be used as weapons. They had no survival value in the immediate sense. And yet they were made, and they were kept, and they were sometimes placed in burials with the dead. This suggests that they were valued for reasons beyond their practical utility. They were valued because they were beautiful, because they expressed something, because they meant something to the people who made them. The earliest known art comes from caves in Europe, particularly in Spain and France. The cave of Chauvet, with its paintings of animals in motion, has been dated to at least 32,000 years ago. The paintings are skilled, showing knowledge of anatomy and movement and perspective. The artists understood proportion, understood how to show depth and movement on a flat surface. This suggests that painting didn't suddenly appear fully formed in the Stone Age. It was the culmination of a long process of development, of learning and refining techniques. The subject matter of Stone Age art was mostly animals. Horses, bison, mammoths, rhinoceroses, bears, lions. The animals that were hunted or that posed a threat to humans. Some depictions of handprints, some interpretations of which suggest that they were created by individuals placing their hand on the wall and blowing pigment around it, creating a negative image of their hand. This is a remarkable act, almost a signature, a statement of presence. I was here, I made this mark, I existed. The purpose of the art is not entirely clear. It may have been spiritual or religious in nature, part of rituals related to hunting. It may have been instructional, teaching younger people about animals. It may have been purely aesthetic, created because people wanted to create beauty. It may have been all of these things. What seems clear is that the capacity to create art, to take pigments or tools and create images of something other than what was immediately necessary for survival, is distinctly human. And it appeared early in the human story, in the Stone Age, and has remained with us ever since. Music appears to have been part of Stone Age culture as well. Bone flutes have been found in Stone Age sites, and they can still produce notes when played. Someone made these flutes with care and with skill, carved the bone to create specific pitches and tones. And someone played them, made music. Probably as part of rituals, probably in group gatherings, probably for the joy of creating and hearing music. The appearance of art and music in the Stone Age suggests that humans were not simply focused on survival. There was time and energy and mental space for other things, for things that brought pleasure or meaning or beauty. This suggests a level of security, of confidence in the future, that allowed people to think about more than just the next meal. Religious or spiritual beliefs are present in the archaeological record of the Stone Age. The burial practices suggest that people believed in something beyond the immediate physical world. The careful placement of the body, the inclusion of objects, the possible use of flowers, all suggest that death was not seen as the end but as a transition. The cave sites that show evidence of repeated use for apparently ritual purposes, sites with little evidence of habitation but with evidence of repeated visits and activities, suggest that people gathered for rituals and ceremonies. These might have been initiations, ceremonies marking the passage from adolescence to adulthood. They might have been rituals related to hunting, performed before a hunt to ensure success. They might have been ceremonies related to death and the afterlife. We don't know. But the evidence suggests that human beings in the Stone Age had beliefs and practices that went beyond the practical needs of survival. The creation of art, the burial of the dead with care and ceremony, the making of music, the apparent gathering for ritual purposes, all of these suggest that human beings in the Stone Age had a spiritual life, a life of meaning and belief and practice that existed alongside the physical life of hunting and gathering and making tools. This spiritual life was probably central to the cohesion and the continuation of the group. The rituals that marked the passage of individuals from one status to another, the ceremonies that honored the dead, the songs and stories that explained the world and the group's place in it, all of these created shared meaning and bound the group together. A group that had common beliefs and common practices was a group that could trust each other, could work together, could plan for the future together. The shamans or spiritual leaders of the Stone Age were probably people who had special knowledge of the spiritual world, who could access the world of the spirits and the ancestors through trance or through the consumption of psychoactive plants. Their role was probably similar to the role of shamans in more recent hunter-gatherer societies, serving as healers, as people who could intervene with the spiritual forces to ensure success in hunts, to cure illnesses, to guide people through important transitions. The knowledge of plants and minerals that had psychoactive properties is probably ancient, going back to the Stone Age or even before. The fact that shamans in modern hunter-gatherer societies use plant hallucinogens suggests that the use of these plants has a long history. The rituals associated with their use, the songs and stories and knowledge that accumulated around them, were probably as elaborate and as valued as any other form of knowledge in Stone Age societies. The seasons structured the lives of Stone Age people in ways that are hard for us to understand today. In temperate climates, winter was a time of scarcity and danger. Food had to be stored or hunted as it became available. The days were short and the nights were long. The cold could be deadly. In some places and some years, groups might not make it through the winter. People might die from cold, from disease, from starvation. Summer was a time of abundance. Plants bore fruit, and their seeds became available. The days were long, and hunting was easier. Large herds of animals migrated, and hunts could be successful. This was the time to build up stores of food, to cure meat and fish for the winter, to gather plants and preserve them. This was the time when multiple groups might gather together to trade, to exchange members, to perform rituals, to reaffirm bonds between groups. Autumn was a time of transition. The plants were ripening, and there was time to gather the last of the seasonal plants. Animals were getting fat, preparing for winter, and hunts were productive. This was the time to prepare for winter, to make or repair clothing, to prepare shelters for the cold months. Spring was the time of hardship. Winter stores had been exhausted or were running low. The winter had weakened people, and disease was common. New plants were beginning to grow, but they were still small and hadn't yet accumulated the nutrients they would have later in the season. Animals that had survived the winter were thin and not very nutritious. This was probably the season when most people died, when food scarcity was most severe. But spring was also the time of hope. The long nights were ending, the light was returning, new plants were beginning to grow. The ice was melting, and the rivers were beginning to flow. The migrating animals were beginning to move back toward their summer ranges. Survival through winter brought the expectation that summer would follow, and with summer would come abundance. This seasonal rhythm structured the year. The knowledge of when to move to different locations to exploit different resources, when to gather certain plants, when to hunt certain animals. All of this was structured around the seasons. A group that didn't understand the seasons, that didn't know when to harvest and when to hunt and when to store food for winter, would not survive long. The knowledge of the seasons was survival knowledge, and it was central to the success of every Stone Age group. The movement between different locations, the transhumance that many groups probably practiced, moving between a winter camp and summer camps, exploiting different resources in different places, required knowledge of the landscape, knowledge of where the resources were, and knowledge of the routes between places. This knowledge was probably maintained by the elders and was taught to younger members of the group as they came of age. The first time a child learned to make fire, the first time a young person participated in a hunt, the first time a woman gave birth, these were moments of transition that marked a change in status within the group. The rituals that probably surrounded these moments were ways of recognizing and celebrating these transitions. Initiation rituals, ceremonies that marked the passage from childhood to adulthood, probably existed in Stone Age societies. Young people might have to complete challenges, hunting an animal of a certain size, traveling a certain distance, spending time alone in the wilderness, fasting, or other ordeals. These challenges served to test whether the young person was ready for the responsibilities of adulthood. More importantly, they served to mark the moment of transition, to make it clear to the group and to the individual that a change in status had occurred. The rituals of puberty, particularly for young women, were probably important occasions. The beginning of menstruation was significant because it marked fertility, the ability to bear children. Rituals surrounding this event might have involved instruction about the significance of this change, about the responsibilities that came with fertility, about the rituals that would surround childbirth and motherhood. The rituals surrounding marriage or the formation of pair bonds probably existed as well. The joining of two people, or the joining of two groups through marriage, was significant because it created new bonds, created alliances, created networks of kinship that extended the group. The rituals that marked these events served to make them public, to create witnesses to the commitment, to bind the groups together. Death rituals were probably important occasions as well. The death of a group member, particularly the death of an elder who had been important to the group, was a significant loss. The rituals surrounding death served to mark the transition, to allow the group to grieve, to honor the dead, and to reaffirm the bonds between the living. The burial of the dead, the placement of objects with the body, the possible construction of a grave marker, all of these served to mark the place where death had occurred, to create a place of memory. The rituals of the group, the ceremonies that marked the seasons and the transitions in people's lives, created continuity. They created a sense that the present was connected to the past, that the ancestors were remembered, that there would be a future in which the rituals would continue. They created meaning and order in a world that could often seem chaotic and unpredictable. Language was the technology that made all other human technologies possible. Without the ability to communicate complex ideas, to plan for the future, to teach and to learn, none of the other achievements of the Stone Age would have been possible. But language doesn't appear suddenly. It develops gradually, over thousands of generations, with changes and innovations building on what came before. The language spoken by people in the Stone Age, we assume, was as complex as modern language, with grammar and syntax and the ability to express abstract ideas. But we don't know exactly when this level of complexity was achieved. The earliest evidence for language comes from the behavior of people in the archaeological record. The existence of art, of tools adapted to different purposes, of evidence of planning and cooperation. All of these suggest language of some sophistication. If people were creating paintings of animals, they must have been able to discuss the subjects of the paintings. If people were coordinating hunts, they must have been able to discuss strategy. The development of spoken language left no archaeological record. Unlike stone tools or paintings, words don't survive in the ground. We have to infer the presence of language from other evidence, from the complexity of behavior, from the evidence of planning and cooperation and teaching. And based on that evidence, we can conclude that language of considerable complexity existed in the Stone Age. The meanings of words were probably grounded in the concrete world, words for animals, for plants, for actions. But early language probably also had words for colors, for shapes, for relationships between objects. Gradually, probably, came words for abstract concepts, time, causation, obligation, possibility. The development of tense, the ability to discuss past and future as well as present, allowed people to plan for the future and to learn from the past. The power of language was that it allowed knowledge to be transmitted without each generation having to rediscover everything through trial and error. A technique for making a tool could be described and taught rather than rediscovered. A story about a hunting technique or a dangerous animal could be passed on and learned. The knowledge of which plants were safe to eat and which were poisonous could be transmitted orally, with the authority of an experienced elder teaching an apprentice. The language of the Stone Age was probably rich in vocabulary related to the immediate environment. Many words for different types of animals, different types of plants, different weather conditions, different landscape features. It probably was rich in terms related to kinship, with different words for different types of relatives and different relationships. It probably included rituals and traditional formulae, words and phrases that were repeated in contexts like rituals or storytelling. Trade and contact between different groups appear in the archaeological record of the Stone Age. Objects made of materials that don't occur locally, shells from the coast found far inland, flint from specific deposits found in distant locations, suggest that these materials were traded or that people traveled long distances to obtain them. The exchange of goods created networks of contact between groups. A valuable shell, a particularly high-quality piece of flint, an unusual stone suitable for making tools. These might be passed from group to group, traveling hundreds of kilometers from their source. But trade probably wasn't only about goods. It was also about knowledge and ideas and probably marriage partners and genes. The gatherings where different groups came together. At good hunting locations, at seasons when resources were abundant, at ritual sites, were opportunities for trade and for the exchange of marriage partners. Young people from one group might marry into another group, creating bonds of kinship that linked the groups together. Techniques and ideas could be shared. Stories and songs could be learned. Goods could be exchanged. These networks of contact were important for the survival of groups. A group isolated by geography or circumstance, unable to engage in trade and exchange, faced higher risk. Diseases that swept through one group couldn't spread if the group was isolated. But a group that was completely isolated also was limited in its access to resources, unable to obtain materials from distant sources, unable to benefit from the knowledge of other groups. The optimal situation, probably, was a group that was part of a network but not so densely connected that diseases or conflicts spread rapidly. The maintenance of these networks probably required travel, communication, meetings between groups. Some individuals probably traveled more than others, acted as traders or go-betweens, maintaining relationships and facilitating exchange between groups. The evidence from genetics shows that these networks of exchange did exist and did function effectively. DNA from Stone Age people shows evidence of gene flow from different regions, suggesting that people from distant areas did interbreed, that individuals did travel and settle in new groups, that the human population was not isolated into small, separate groups but was part of a larger network of populations. The climate changes that occurred during the Stone Age affected all the groups that lived during this period. As the ice ages came and went, the landscape changed, the animals that lived in different areas changed, and the plants that were available changed. Groups had to adapt to these changes or move to new locations. Some groups adapted by changing their diet, exploiting resources that were previously less important. Some groups moved to new locations, following the animals or the plants that they depended on. Some groups became extinct, unable to adapt to the changes and unable to migrate to locations with resources they could exploit. The great extinction of megafauna at the end of the last ice age, the mammoths, the giant sloths, the saber-toothed cats, was probably caused by a combination of climate change and hunting pressure. As the climate warmed and the vegetation changed, the animals that had been adapted to the ice age climate found it harder to survive. At the same time, human hunters became more effective at hunting, developing better weapons and hunting strategies. The combination of these two factors caused many species to go extinct. But humans survived. Groups in different regions adapted to the changes, developed new food sources, developed new tools and techniques suited to the new environment. The transition from the ice age to the warmer climate was probably difficult, with groups moving to new locations, populations declining in some areas and increasing in others. But humans adapted successfully. The development of agriculture, sometime after the end of the last ice age, represented a new adaptation to the changing world. In some regions, the climate and the plants that grew there were suited to cultivation. People began to deliberately plant seeds and tend the plants, creating a more reliable food source than hunting and gathering. This transition from hunting and gathering to agriculture was probably gradual, with people in transitional zones exploiting both wild and cultivated plants. The relationship between humans and the landscape changed during the Stone Age. Early humans were probably mostly passive inhabitants of the landscape, hunting animals and gathering plants, but not making significant changes to the landscape. But as populations increased and as tool technology improved, humans became more active in shaping the landscape. The use of fire to clear vegetation, to create open areas where certain plants would grow, was probably a technique used by Stone Age people in many parts of the world. The creation of grasslands through controlled burning would have benefited the large grazing animals that humans hunted. The clearing of forest to create open areas near camps would have made them safer from predators and made certain tasks easier. The hunting of large animals to extinction or near extinction changed the landscape. In North America, the extinction of mammoths, giant ground sloths, and other megafauna after the arrival of humans changed the vegetation patterns. Plants that had depended on these large animals for seed dispersal or for periodic grazing were affected. The entire ecosystem shifted. The harvesting of trees for firewood, for building, for tool-making would have affected forest composition in areas near human settlements. In regions where humans stayed for long periods, the easily accessible trees would have been harvested, and the composition of the forest would have shifted toward trees that were less useful to humans. These changes were probably not intentional. Humans were not trying to reshape the landscape in any systematic way. They were simply meeting their immediate needs, getting food, getting fuel, getting building materials. But the cumulative effect of their actions was to change the landscape in ways that persisted long after the humans had moved or died. The understanding that humans could change the landscape, that the choices they made had long-term consequences, probably developed slowly during the Stone Age. But by the time of agriculture, It was clear that human action could transform the landscape in fundamental ways. The deliberate planting and tending of crops was a conscious attempt to reshape the landscape to benefit humans. And from that point on, the relationship between humans and the landscape became increasingly one-sided, with humans transforming the landscape to their purposes. The knowledge of the human body, of health and disease, developed during the Stone Age. People learned which injuries could be survived and which were fatal. They learned which illnesses could be treated and which could not. They learned which plants helped with pain and which with fever. They learned techniques for childbirth, for treating wounds, for dealing with injuries. Some of this knowledge came from trial and error, from a person trying a remedy and then repeating it if it seemed to work. Some of it came from observation of animals, watching how animals treated their own injuries or illnesses. Some of it probably came from shamans or healers who claimed to have special knowledge from the spirit world. The archaeological evidence of healed injuries shows that people survived injuries that would be difficult or impossible to treat today without modern medicine. A broken leg that healed in a displaced position, showing that someone with that leg was unable to walk normally, nevertheless survived for years after the injury. This suggests that the group took care of the injured person, providing food and protection while the injury healed. The presence of individuals with disabilities or illnesses in some burials suggests that these people were valued by their groups despite their inability to contribute directly to hunting and gathering. An old woman with severe arthritis, who would have had difficulty walking or working, was nevertheless buried with care and objects placed with her body. This suggests a sense of compassion, of recognizing the value of people beyond their immediate economic contribution. The knowledge of plants for medicine was probably extensive. Different plants were used for different purposes: to stop bleeding, to reduce fever, to ease pain, to help with childbirth, to treat digestive problems. The knowledge of which plants worked for which purposes would have come from generations of observation and experimentation. The recognition that illness could be treated, that some conditions could be cured, probably created a belief in the power of healers and shamans. These individuals, who claimed to have knowledge of how to treat illness and injury, probably held special status in the group. Their knowledge, even if it wasn't always effective, gave people hope and gave the group a sense that something could be done in the face of illness and injury. The development of clothing technology was a crucial adaptation to cold climates. The earliest evidence of clothing comes from tools, bone needles, evidence of sewn seams, suggesting that by the time of the later Stone Age, people were making fitted clothing rather than simply wrapping hides around their bodies. The knowledge of how to prepare hides, how to scrape them clean, how to tan them to make them supple, how to sew them together, was crucial knowledge. The tools necessary for this work, bone needles, bone scrapers, edges of flint that could cut through hide, had to be made and maintained. The techniques for tanning had to be learned and transmitted. The construction of shelters was another crucial adaptation. In regions where caves were not available, people had to build their own shelters. Evidence of postholes and constructed walls suggests that people built simple structures, probably with frames of wood or bone covered with hides or plant material. These structures provided protection from wind and rain and helped retain the warmth of a central fire. The insulation of shelters, the construction of them in locations protected from wind, the organization of space inside shelters, all of these show evidence of careful thought and planning. The placement of a hearth in the center of a shelter, with sleeping areas arranged around it, would have distributed warmth throughout the structure. The construction of walls and roofs would have protected people from wind and rain and snow. The knowledge of how to survive in cold climates, what kind of clothing was needed, how shelters should be built, what kind of fires were necessary, what kind of diet was needed to provide enough calories to maintain body heat, was crucial to survival in the Stone Age ice ages. The groups that successfully adapted to cold were the ones that had this knowledge and could transmit it to the next generation. The survival of humans in the frozen steppes of Eurasia, the occupation of regions that earlier human ancestors would not have been able to survive in, shows the power of cultural adaptation. Without genetic changes, without evolution of thicker body hair or more efficient temperature regulation, humans adapted to cold through cultural means. through the invention of better clothing, better shelters, better ways of getting and keeping warm. The relationship to death was probably complex in the Stone Age. Death was an event that required some kind of response. Whether it was feared, whether it was seen as the end or as a transition to another form of existence, we don't know. But the care and ceremony with which some bodies were buried suggests that death was recognized as significant and worthy of respect. The burial of the dead required effort and resources. The body had to be transported to the burial site, which might be some distance away. A grave had to be dug, which required tools and effort. Objects might be placed with the body or placed at the grave site. The grave might be marked in some way so that the location would be remembered. All of this required time and effort that could have been used for other purposes. The fact that this time and effort were invested in burial suggests that the group saw value in it. Perhaps they believed that the dead needed to be properly buried to reach an afterlife. Perhaps they believed that the spirits of the dead could affect the living, and that proper burial would ensure the benevolence of those spirits. Perhaps they simply believed that it was the right thing to do, a way of honoring someone who had been important to the group. The presence of grave goods, objects placed with the body or at the grave site, suggests that the dead were seen as having needs or desires. The food placed in some graves suggests a belief that the dead needed to eat. The tools and weapons suggest that the dead might need them in an afterlife. The ornaments suggest that appearance and status mattered even in death. The flowers that appear in some burials, detected through pollen analysis, suggest that people gathered flowers to place with the dead. This is a remarkable act, taking time to gather flowers that were not food, not tools, not of practical value, and placing them with the dead. This suggests that beauty mattered, that the dead were worthy of beauty, that the act of creating a beautiful burial site was important. The rituals surrounding death and burial probably served functions beyond the spiritual. They gave the group an opportunity to gather, to reaffirm bonds between members, to grieve together. They allowed time for the emotions of loss to be acknowledged and processed. They created continuity with the past, a sense that the dead were not entirely gone, that they remained part of the group in memory and in ritual. The capacity for symbolic thought is one of the defining characteristics of human beings, and it appears early in the archaeological record. The use of symbols, objects or marks that stand for something other than their physical presence, requires a particular kind of thinking, a capacity to let one thing represent another. The personal ornaments found in Stone Age sites, shells, teeth, bones, stones, were probably objects that carried meaning. They might have indicated status or role within the group. They might have identified the wearer as belonging to a particular group or kinship line. They might have been symbols of achievement or accomplishment. They might have been simply beautiful objects that people liked to wear and display. The evidence that shells and other materials were traded over long distances shows that certain objects were valued enough to be obtained from distant sources and passed from hand to hand. This suggests that these objects carried meaning that transcended their material value, that they were valued for what they represented. The marks and carvings on bone and antler pieces are harder to interpret. They might be tally marks, keeping count of hunts or passes of the moon. They might be decorative, creating patterns that the makers found pleasing. They might be symbolic, representing something important to the maker. They might be writing, the earliest attempts to record information in a permanent form. The development of symbolic thinking allowed for the creation of art and music, the development of ritual and ceremony, the organization of knowledge. It allowed for the communication of complex ideas, for the development of religion and philosophy. It allowed for the understanding of cause and effect, for the planning of future actions based on past experience. The symbolic thinking that developed in the Stone Age is the foundation of all human culture that followed. The ability to create symbols, to share their meaning, to use them to understand and organize the world, is what makes us human. And it appears early, in the paintings and carvings and ornaments of the Stone Age, suggesting that this capacity was crucial to human success from the earliest times. The Stone Age is often presented as a period of stability, with the same way of life continuing for hundreds of thousands of years. But the archaeological record shows that there were constant changes, innovations, adaptations to changing environments. The invention of new tools happened gradually. Someone discovered that shaping stone in a new way produced a better edge, and that technique was learned and transmitted. Someone discovered that bone could be worked, shaped into useful tools, and that technique was learned. Someone discovered that composite tools, combining stone and bone and wood and adhesives, could be more effective than simple tools, and that knowledge was shared. The movement into new environments required adaptation. Groups that moved into colder climates had to develop new technology. Better clothing, better shelters, better ways of starting and maintaining fires. Groups that moved into coastal areas had to develop new techniques for exploiting marine resources. Groups that moved into forests had to develop new hunting and gathering strategies suited to the forest environment. The development of more complex social organization happened gradually. The evidence of leadership, of specialized roles, of trade networks, of long-distance contact, all of this suggests social structures that were more complex than simple egalitarian bands. But the evidence also suggests that this complexity was limited, that groups remained relatively small, and that specialization was limited. The development of art and music was gradual, an accumulation of small innovations and refinements. The earliest paintings are not crude attempts at realism, but skilled representations of animals, suggesting that painting had a long history of development before the times when we see the most skillfully executed examples. The Stone Age was a period of remarkable human achievement and adaptation. Without the advantages of written language, without the advantages of domesticated animals or agriculture, without the advantages of metal tools, humans nevertheless developed complex social organizations, created art and music, developed sophisticated hunting and gathering techniques, adapted to diverse environments from the tropical coast to the frozen steppe. The knowledge, ingenuity, and creativity that this required is remarkable and deserves to be recognized. The relationship of Stone Age people to the animals they hunted was probably more complex than simple predator-prey relationship. The animals appeared in their art, suggesting that they held some significance beyond mere food. The mammoths, bison, horses, and other animals that were the main subject matter of cave paintings were the animals that were hunted, but they were also, apparently, the animals that were worthy of being represented in art. This might suggest that the hunters had some sense of respect or relationship with the hunted animals. Some modern hunter-gatherer societies maintain practices and beliefs that suggest a sense of relationship with the animals they hunt, apologizing to the animal, performing ceremonies thanking the animal, limiting the number of animals killed. Whether similar practices existed in the Stone Age, we can't know. But the fact that hunted animals were depicted in art suggests that they were important not just as food. The extinction of megafauna that occurred at the end of the last ice age was probably caused by a combination of climate change and human hunting. But the rate of extinction, faster than can be explained by climate change alone, suggests that human hunting played a significant role. This suggests that humans, by the end of the Stone Age, had become effective enough hunters that they could drive animal species to extinction. The understanding that hunting pressure could lead to extinction probably came too late, after many species had already disappeared. But the experience of extinctions might have led to the development of conservation practices, limiting the number of animals killed, protecting certain animals during certain seasons, creating refuges where animals were not hunted. These practices are documented in later societies, and they might have their origins in the experience of the extinctions. The relationship with domesticated animals came later, after the development of agriculture. But before domestication, the relationship with wild animals was one of hunters and hunted. It was a relationship of dependence, where humans depended on animals for food, for materials for clothing and tools, for inspiration for art and ritual. The animals that were hunted were often the ones that were most significant in the culture, in the art, in the rituals, in the stories. This might suggest that the animals that were most important economically were also the ones that were most important culturally, that the survival of the group depended on the successful hunting of these animals, and that this economic importance was reflected in their cultural significance. The final phase of the Stone Age, after the Ice Ages and before the development of agriculture, is known as the Mesolithic in Europe and has different names in other regions. During this period, humans adapted to the warmer, wetter climate that followed the end of the Ice Ages. The vegetation changed, the animals changed, and human societies changed in response. Forests expanded, covering areas that had been open steppe or tundra. The large grazing animals that had dominated the Ice Age ecosystems became less common. Humans adapted by developing new hunting strategies, focusing on smaller animals and new sources of food. Fishing became more important, as water resources became more available. The exploitation of maritime resources became more intensive in coastal areas. The tools and techniques of the Mesolithic show adaptation to this new environment. Smaller stone tools, microliths, were developed, suitable for hunting smaller animals and for making composite tools. Fishing equipment became more elaborate, with harpoon points designed specifically for fishing rather than hunting terrestrial animals. The domestication of the dog, which was probably used for hunting, appears during this period. The social organization of Mesolithic societies shows evidence of increasing complexity. Some sites show evidence of permanent or semi-permanent settlements, where groups stayed for longer periods rather than following the seasonal migrations of the hunting and gathering societies. The evidence of cemeteries suggests that burial practices became more standardized and more elaborate. The development of pottery appears during the Mesolithic in some regions, though not universally. The ability to make containers that could hold liquid without leaking opened new possibilities for cooking and for food storage. It allowed for the preparation of foods that required boiling, for the creation of fermented foods, for the storage of liquids. The transition from the Mesolithic to the Neolithic, from purely hunting and gathering societies to agricultural societies, happened gradually in most places. For some time, communities practiced a mixed economy, exploiting both wild and domesticated plants and animals. Gradually, in some regions, agriculture became more important and eventually became the dominant food source. But in other regions, hunting and gathering remained important even after agriculture had been adopted in nearby areas. In regions where the environment was particularly favorable for wild plants and animals, where the return on investment from hunting and gathering was greater than the return from agriculture, societies maintained their hunter-gatherer way of life for thousands of years after agriculture had been developed elsewhere. The legacy of the Stone Age is visible in human bodies and human minds today. The digestive system of modern humans is still adapted to the diet of Stone Age hunter-gatherers, which included less refined carbohydrates and more diverse plant and animal foods than the modern diet. The human mind is still adapted to the social structures of the Stone Age, to small groups where everyone knows everyone else, not to large anonymous societies. The capacity for symbolic thinking, for language, for art and music, all of which developed during the Stone Age, remains with us. The emotions of grief and joy and fear and courage that we experience today are emotions that were experienced by our Stone Age ancestors. The sense of meaning and purpose that comes from belonging to a group, from having a role to play, from contributing to something larger than oneself, is something that was important in the Stone Age and remains important today. The knowledge of the natural world, the accumulated understanding of plants and animals and landscapes that was crucial for survival in the Stone Age, has mostly been lost. The knowledge that specific plants could be used for medicine, that certain foods contained important nutrients, that there were times of year when certain resources were available. This knowledge has been replaced by books and education and science. But it was knowledge that took hundreds of thousands of years to accumulate, and there might be value in recovering some of it. The artistic and musical capacities that appeared in the Stone Age and found expression in the paintings and flutes and carvings remain as potential in modern humans. Some people develop these capacities, creating art and music that moves and inspires others. Some people find in the creation of art a sense of meaning and purpose that transcends the material concerns of daily life. The spiritual capacities that found expression in ritual and ceremony and belief during the Stone Age remain with us as well. The sense that there is more to human existence than the purely material, that there are questions of meaning and purpose that science cannot fully answer, that there are forces or dimensions of reality that transcend the physical world. These are aspects of human experience that were important in the Stone Age and remain important today. The Stone Age is not truly past. It lives in us, in our bodies and our minds and our capacities, in the abilities and needs and potentials that were shaped by hundreds of thousands of years of evolution and culture in the Stone Age world. The transition from the Stone Age to the Bronze Age and beyond was gradual. It wasn't that at one moment people were using stone tools and at the next moment they were using metal tools. Rather, metal tools became available and useful for certain purposes, and gradually more people adopted them, and gradually metal became more common than stone for certain tools. But the knowledge of stone toolmaking didn't disappear entirely. In many regions of the world, people continued to use stone tools for certain purposes even after metal tools had been invented. Stone tools were useful for certain applications, easier to make quickly when a tool was needed, not requiring the trade networks and expertise that the production of metal tools required. The cognitive capabilities that were developed in the Stone Age, the capacity for symbolic thought, for language, for planning and cooperation, for art and ritual, were not displaced by the invention of metal tools. They continued and expanded. The ability to write, when it was invented thousands of years after the end of the Stone Age, built on the capacity for symbolic thought that had developed during the Stone Age. The social structures and cultural practices that developed during the Stone Age formed the foundation for later developments. The capacity for group organization, for leadership, for trade and exchange, for ritual and ceremony, all of which existed in complex forms during the Stone Age, expanded and developed into the complex societies of the Bronze Age and beyond. The development of agriculture, which happened after the Stone Age, was based on the knowledge of plants that had been accumulated during the Stone Age. The understanding of which plants were useful, when they ripened, how to prepare them, was knowledge that came from tens of thousands of years of gathering and observation. The most important legacy of the Stone Age is not the tools, which were superseded by better tools, but the development of human culture and human capability. The capacity for language, for art, for symbolic thought, for complex social organization, for the accumulation and transmission of knowledge. All of these developed during the Stone Age and remain as the foundation of human achievement. When we think about the Stone Age, we almost invariably think about hunting, about mammoths and bison and spears and hunters. But that image, while not false, is incomplete in a way that distorts our understanding of how prehistoric groups actually lived. The gathering of plants was in many contexts and at many times of year as important as hunting, and the botanical knowledge that human groups accumulated during the Stone Age was of a depth and sophistication that still amazes modern researchers when they try to document it in cultures that still preserve it partially. Think about what it means to know the plants of a territory without books, without laboratories, without the possibility of looking something up when you have a question. It means having observed them for a whole lifetime and having listened to them described throughout a whole childhood. Knowing which are edible and which are poisonous not by their surface appearance but by their specific characteristics, the smell when the leaf is crushed, the texture of the stem, the color of the juice that comes out when broken, the way they grow and what kind of soil they prefer. Knowing when they're at their optimal point for harvesting, not when they look ripe from the outside, but when the starch or sugar or active compounds have reached their maximum. Knowing how to prepare them to make them edible, because many plants that are toxic raw become nutritious when processed correctly through heat, fermentation, prolonged soaking, or other methods. This knowledge was enormously detailed and enormously specific to the territory. The same plants could have different properties in different soils, different exposures, different altitudes. Knowledge that was valid in one valley might not be completely valid in the neighboring valley. That's why it was so important to transmit it with precision, without omissions or inaccuracies that could prove fatal. A generation that lost the knowledge of which plants were poisonous in their specific territory was a generation in real danger. Medicinal plants deserve special mention. The use of plants to treat illnesses and wounds is probably as ancient as humanity itself. Studies of chimpanzees in the wild document that these primates ingest specific plants when they're ill, plants that have real antiparasitic or antibacterial properties. If our closest relatives do this instinctively, it's reasonable to assume that the hominids that preceded Homo sapiens had similar behaviors that over time transformed into systematically acquired and consciously transmitted knowledge. Archaeological sites offer some direct evidence of the use of medicinal plants. In the cave of Shanidar in Iraq, where several Neanderthal burials were found, concentrations of pollen from plants with known medicinal properties were detected around one of the skeletons, which some researchers interpreted as evidence that the deceased was buried with medicinal flowers. The interpretation was later questioned, but the discussion it generated showed the importance of prehistoric phytomedicine. Hallucinogenic or psychoactive plants probably had a special place in the botanical knowledge of prehistoric groups. The shaman or healer who accessed the spiritual world through altered states of consciousness frequently used specific plants to induce those states. The knowledge of which plants produced what types of states, in what doses, in what preparations, was specialized knowledge that was carefully guarded and transmitted only to initiates. The history of humanity's relationship with psychoactive plants is as long as the history of humanity itself, and it has deep roots in the Stone Age. Seeds and dried fruits were especially important as a source of dense, easily storable energy. Acorns, which we today consider mainly animal food, were a staple food for many human groups in temperate regions of the world. Rich in starch and fats, they could be stored for months without deteriorating if kept correctly. The process of making them edible required removing the tannins that make them bitter, which was accomplished by prolonged soaking in running water, a process that required knowledge and planning but produced a nutritious and versatile food. Berries, wild fruits, mushrooms, tubers, starchy roots, young leaves of certain plants in spring, young shoots before they accumulate the defensive compounds that make them inedible in maturity, all of that made up a diverse and micronutrient-rich diet that complemented the protein and fat from hunting. The variety of that diet was one of its main virtues. In a world without vitamin supplements or blood tests, the best way to avoid nutritional deficiencies was to eat as wide a variety of foods as possible. Groups that lived near water had access to additional food sources that were especially valuable. Fish, shellfish, waterfowl, turtles, frogs. Marine coasts were especially rich, with their tidal ecosystems full of organisms that could be gathered by hand in the hours of low tide. The shell middens, the deposits of mollusk shells that coastal groups accumulated over years or generations, are among the most important archaeological sites for understanding the lives of coastal hunter-gatherers, because they preserve bones, tools, ornaments, and sometimes burials that give us a much more complete picture of those communities than interior sites. The knowledge of plants was not just survival knowledge. It was also aesthetic knowledge, spiritual, narrative knowledge. The plants had names, they had stories, they had places in the mythology of the group. The tree under which the council of elders gathered. The grass that grew only in the place where the great hunter of the previous generation had died. The flower that announced the arrival of spring and whose first appearance was celebrated with specific rituals. Plants were not just resources. They were part of the meaningful landscape in which the group lived and which was as constitutive of its identity as the people who composed it. That knowledge of the plant world, accumulated over tens of thousands of years of observation and experience, is one of humanity's most valuable and most threatened patrimonies. The cultures that still preserve it in relatively complete forms are fewer and fewer, and the cultural erosion that accompanies modernization is reducing at an accelerated pace the number of people who know their own ecosystems with the depth that our Stone Age ancestors knew them. Every elder who dies without transmitting their botanical knowledge is a small extinction, a loss of information that took generations to accumulate and that cannot be recovered simply with books or databases.